Why didn't Jesus Christ date? Why didn't he marry? Why didn't he have children? This question seems simple, but it carries a weight that almost no one dares to face. Because if Jesus had married, if he had loved a woman, if he had had children, the entire religious structure we know today might be completely different. So I ask you, did God forbid Jesus from marrying? Is there any biblical text that condemns this? Or did this idea arise much later, with very human interests at its core? Stick with me, because what we're about to uncover could change how you see everything. Let's get straight to the point. There is no verse in the Bible, not a single one, saying that Jesus could not marry, none. What exists is silence, a complete silence on the matter, and silence is not a prohibition. Think about it. The Bible also doesn't say that Jesus never laughed. It doesn't say that Jesus never fell in love. It doesn't say that Jesus never desired a simple, ordinary life. It only records what was absolutely essential to his message and mission. Jesus was not some isolated monk, detached from the world. He was the opposite. He went to parties. He famously turned water into wine at a wedding. He sat down and ate with people labeled as sinners. The Gospels show us that he wept. He felt anguish. He even felt fear in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was fully God, yes, but he was also fully man. So ask yourself honestly, would loving someone, would getting married, have made Jesus less holy? Or would it have made him even more relatable to our human experience? The answer isn't as clear-cut as we've been led to believe. Now we get to the part that changes everything. Jesus didn't stay single because God forbade it. He chose not to marry. And why did he make that choice? Because he was on a mission that demanded total abandonment of a normal life. It involved constant persecution, a continuous risk of death, a complete lack of stability, and ultimately, a cross. Just imagine for a moment, imagine trying to have a wife and children, knowing that you were destined to be publicly executed. Imagine living as a fugitive, being hunted by the authorities, never knowing if you would make it back home at the end of the day. This was not a life compatible with a typical family. It was an extreme mission that required extreme focus. Celibacy, in this case, wasn't the rule. It was a practical consequence of his unique and all-consuming calling. If this is already starting to challenge what you've always heard, do me a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel. Because from here on out, the conversation gets even more uncomfortable, and even more important. Now, hold on to this next piece of information, because it's a bombshell. Peter, the disciple Jesus called the Rock, the man considered by the Catholic Church to be the very first pope, was married. The Bible is explicit about this. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we read about Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. And let's be clear, there is no mother-in-law without a wife. This isn't some hidden code, it's right there in the text. The apostles, the foundational leaders of the early church, were not required to be celibate. In fact, the apostle Paul, writing to Timothy, gives instructions for choosing church leaders. He states that a bishop, a leader in the church, must be faithful to his wife, implying that marriage was the norm, not the exception. This is in the Bible, not in some lost or apocryphal book, not in a wild conspiracy theory. It's right there in the New Testament. So this brings us to the question that very few people in authority like to answer. If the first leaders of the church, including the first pope, were married, why is it forbidden for priests and the pope today? The answer to that question is not spiritual, it's historical. Mandatory celibacy for clergy did not come from Jesus. It didn't come from the apostles. It was a rule established centuries later by the church as an institution, and the real reasons behind it were far more practical than spiritual. It was about power and control. Priests who were married had families and heirs. When they died, church property, like land and assets, could be passed down to their children, dividing the church's wealth and power. By enforcing celibacy, the church could ensure that all property and wealth stayed within the institution. It was a way to centralize power and keep assets from being scattered. It was an administrative decision, a purely institutional law, but over time, what started as a rule became a doctrine. That doctrine then became a moral code, and that moral code became a tool for judgment. And so, this idea was born that sex, even within marriage, is somehow base or sinful, that marriage weakens one's faith, and that true spiritual leadership requires the repression of natural human desires. None of this comes directly from the teachings of Jesus. Now, let's observe the glaring contradiction. Think about evangelical pastors or leaders in many other Protestant denominations. They date, they get married, they have children, they lead their churches, they preach the gospel, and this doesn't cause a scandal or contradict the Bible. Why? Because the Bible never forbade it in the first place. What changes is not God's standard, it's human tradition. And tradition, when it goes unquestioned for too long, can become a prison. So let's bring this into the modern day. If a Catholic priest or even the Pope were to decide to get married today, would he be sinning against God? Based on the Bible, no. Would he be going against the scriptures? No. Would he be breaking a rule of the Catholic Church? Yes, absolutely. And that is what changes everything. The judgment he would face wouldn't come from heaven. It would come from the institution he serves. And it would come from a society that has been conditioned for centuries not to question this rule. Would he lose his credibility? Well, it depends on who you ask. For the church hierarchy, almost certainly, yes. For many ordinary people who are starting to question these things, perhaps not. And for God, no one can say for sure. But we can be certain that a person's character isn't born from their marital status. Holiness doesn't come from repression. For centuries, this rule of mandatory celibacy has been maintained with very little public debate. And what has been the result? A culture of secrecy, stories of double lives, a tremendous burden of guilt and psychological repression placed on good men, and unfortunately, horrific scandals that have rocked the church to its core. When something as natural as love and companionship is forbidden without a clear biblical basis, it doesn't just disappear. It goes into hiding. It festers in the dark. So, let's bring it all home with the uncomfortable truth. Jesus didn't forbid love. Jesus lived a specific, unique calling that made marriage impractical for him. Celibacy can be a noble choice for some, a gift to serve God without distraction, but marriage is also an honor, a sacred institution designed by God himself, and neither one of these states defines who is holy and who is not. The problem was never with God. The problem was, and always has been, when the rules of a human institution take the place of truth. When tradition becomes more important than what the scripture actually says. If this video made you think, or question, or even disagree, that's a good thing. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, share this with someone who has never heard this side of the story. Because a faith that cannot be questioned is not faith. It's fear. Thanks for watching.